Okay. So, hi, I'm Teresa Campos. I'm with the Santa Clara City Library, and today we are welcoming Dr. David Weill. Dr. David Weill is the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease and the Lung Transplant Program at Stanford. He is currently the principal of the Weill Consulting Group, which focuses on improving the delivery of transplant care. Dr. Weill's writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Salon, Newsweek, the Chicago Tribune, Stat, the Washington Post, and Book Riot's 10 most impactful books about public health. Today, the Santa Clara City Library is going to raffle a giveaway book for his book, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and Life in Transplant stay until the end of this program to fill out the entry slip. We're asking that all winners pick up their books at the Central Park Library in Santa Clara. So the structure of our program today is that in the first part, we're going to have a reading and discussion. And then in the second part, we're going to open up to your questions. So feel free to type your questions in the Q&A. So hello, Dr. Weill. Thank you for joining us today.
How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. So why don't you share with us what your book is about?
Exhale is about my life as a transplant doctor. So it's a behind the scenes look at providing transplant care to a very sick patient population. And it talks about the emotional components of what the patients go through, but also what the transplant team goes through as well.
Very nice. Would you like to I have another follow-up question unless you want to jump right into the reading.
It's up to you. I'll do
Okay,
either.
let's do one more follow-up question. Why would you write this book and why now?
When I left Stanford in 2016, after a long career on the front lines of transplant care, I had a lot on my mind. And so I really wanted to get out some of the patient stories and also give the reader an idea about what it feels like to do this kind of work. And over the many years I was in the hospital setting, I took notes in a journal, and those notes ultimately became my book.
Very nice. I mean, your book is filled with a lot of really intimate, very vulnerable stories with your patients. I can't even imagine how you were able to just pick a few and put them in your book, but I think the ones you did capture did show like a progression of growth, even for you, for transplant care overall.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was hard to pick. A lot of the patient stories didn't make it into the book, but maybe for a next book.
Oh, is that a hint at the next book?
Maybe.
All right. Why don't you do a little bit of your reading and then we can follow up a little bit with our discussion.
Sure. I'm gonna bring the reader more toward the beginning of the book when I was actually just falling in love with transplant, and I'll tell a story about how that happened. Like most good things in life, becoming a transplant doctor happened by accident, without any grand plan or strategic calculation. I took a turn, and suddenly it was there, my new love. And like most loves, you know from the beginning how fragile it is. You even expect to lose it one day. I fell in love with transplant in 1990, and it was clear yellow urine that did it. Let me tell you the story. Once upon a time, I was just a kid. Well, not exactly a kid. I was 26 years old, a month removed from my medical school graduation, and 3 hours into my internship at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. Yes, that Parkland Hospital where President Kennedy had died. The program director gathered us fresh interns together and told us that because one of the fifth-year residents had become seriously ill, he needed one of us to volunteer to staff the kidney transplant service. My hand shot up instantly and I was hired. Talk about getting too far over your skis. I haven't even figured out where the Johns were yet, much less being anywhere near equipped to manage a kidney recipient. Off I went, though. Then I thought about it for a moment. This is insane. I didn't know much about medicine, but I did know that transplant medicine is not the bunny slope. However, having been conditioned to take on challenges by my father and my medical training, I accepted. Where's the kidney unit? My question trailed off as our residency chief walked away. No problem, Chief. I'll figure it out, I said to no one in particular. And don't worry, I'll do a hell of a job. Thank God the hospital has great malpractice insurance for us interns, I thought. Before reporting to my new assignment, I walked to my call room to pick up my backpack. The dormitory-style room smelled of unwashed residents and was littered with unread medical journals and discarded soiled scrubs. There was a single bed and a small desk, both of which struck me as funny during my residency. A bed in which I would never be able to sleep, and a desk at which I'd never read. I found the kidney transplant unit 10 minutes later. Ryan McGinnis was there talking with Bobby, the middle-aged man who was going to receive a transplant that night. He was emaciated. His limbs were like 4 sticks poking out of the hospital gown. Just as I walked up, I heard him say, "You mean afterwards there'll be no dialysis?" "That's right, if all goes well," Dr. McGinnis replied. He was too busy writing on the chart to catch Bobby's reaction, which was a combination of disbelief and excitement. Realizing how much his life would change, I became excited too. When one of the nurses called to let me know that Bobby had come through successfully out of his surgery, I ran up 8 flights of stairs, 2 steps at a time, to the kidney transplant unit. I couldn't wait to see if this man would pee, but I was terrified about the very real possibility that I would make a mistake. My pulse was racing, and I thought my heart was going to beat out of my chest. In spite of my inexperience, I was going to be in charge of a new transplant recipient for the next 8 hours. I got to the kidney unit just as Bobby was being wheeled back, the surgical team at his side. After telling the nurses a few details about the operation, the surgical team left. As one of the younger surgeons passed me, he smiled and said, "Call me if you need me if you call me, but remember, calling me is a sign of weakness." I laughed nervously. This was something of a hospital mantra at Parkland that I would hear and say hundreds of times in my 3 years there. I strategically placed my chair right in front of the bag that would collect Bobby's urine, and for the next few hours I just sat there, periodically getting up to talk to the nurses who were trying as hard as I was to stay awake. While waiting for this guy to urinate, I was afraid to go to the bathroom myself, concerned that I might miss something, so I just sat there. When Bobby woke up from the anesthesia, I asked him repeatedly if he was in pain. He kept his eyes closed and mouthed the word "no" each time I asked. So as not to bother him any further, I decided to go down to the cafeteria on the first floor to get some coffee, happy to stretch my legs. When I got back 20 minutes later, I drank my coffee slowly at the bedside, staring at the urine bag. Before I reached the bottom of my styrofoam cup, it happened. Urine happened. I never thought I would be so excited to see yellow liquid passing into a Foley catheter bag. Slow drips at first, and then a steady stream. I turned my back to see if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing, and then turned back to the bag. It was filling up and beginning to bulge out. Turning to the nurses 20 feet away, I said, "Hey, this guy is making urine. Unbelievable." None of the nurses looked up from their paperwork. One of them just took a long sip from her coffee and said, "Great, I'll notify the newspapers. And keep it down. The other patients are sleeping." But who could sleep? I was amazed. Transplants actually worked. I decided to wake the patient to let him in on the big news. "Bobby, can you hear me? Guess what? Your kidney is working." This got his attention. He opened one eye. "Huh?" he said, still groggy. I told him again, "You're making urine." This time he opened both eyes and said, "Don't joke with me." "It's not. It's true." "See," I said. And I held up the plastic container and showed him. Well, I'll be damned. I grabbed his shoulder and we both smiled. That night, both of our lives changed. A patient from South Dallas on Medicaid would be going back to peeing naturally, no longer requiring dialysis 3 times a week. And I, a young intern from the suburbs, had just experienced the magic of transplant, the way it could transform a patient's life in an instant, from sick as hell one day and on the road to recovery the next. I saw that it was more than just the replacing of a body part. It was the giving of a new way of life with unlimited possibilities. Isn't that what all doctors sought when they decided to go into medicine? And so it happened. A jolt of transplant lightning had gone right through me and I was hooked. Giving the gift of hope that night, playing that small part in Bobby's care, sparked a flame that would burn hot in me for the rest of my career. What would I learn after that night in Dallas 30 years ago? A lot. Everything I needed to know, everything I wanted to know, and some things I didn't want to know.
Thank you. I'm so glad you read that part. It shows sort of like where you started and kind of like the feelings of the people around you who are a little bit more senior. Would you say at some point you've adopted very similar, like maybe you're not as excited when you see P or maybe
Well, it's funny. I never lost my amazement at transplant. You know, it's still kind of hard to believe when I see it work. You know, it just seems like a miracle every time it happens. And so, I was the kind of person that never had trouble getting out of bed to go to work because something like this was happening every day.
that that's incredible. I think it in terms of the universal experience of people throughout their careers, I don't know if many can say the same thing. But what I did enjoy about the book is that you do show this interesting relationship between you and transplant programs and care. And you say it yourself, it's like falling in love and being with someone. I felt like it was very similar to like a marriage. There's ups, there's downs, there's moments when the reader isn't sure you guys should be together anymore. Um, what are your feelings now about transplant care? And if you could take a moment to talk to your younger self moments before volunteering for that kidney transplant, what would you tell them?
Yeah, well, it's funny you and I equate it to marriage. My wife calls it my first love. I you know I actually just read something recently where I read an open letter that got published as an essay to medical students. You know, I think the main thing is, you know, and as my career progressed, obviously my, you know, work-life balance wasn't what it should be. And in my open letter to medical students, I encourage them to make work-life balance an intentional practice. In other words, develop a portfolio of things that will make them feel connected, either to their family, to their friends, to their faith, to whatever it is. And you have to work at that too, unfortunately. So whether or not it's exercise or meditation or prayer or whatever, I think that it's important that, you know, that's a priority. It's not just something that, you know, one day we'd like to do. You have to make it an intentional goal.
Yeah, it it sounds like something that would have been very difficult, even with your excerpt that you've read, where they say, don't call me for help because that's a sign of weakness. I think it might be hard to almost change that culture where maybe you do need to ask for help every once in a while.
Yeah, and I think that's improving. I mean, I think that when I trained, you know, back in medical school in the late 80s and most of my residency period in the early 90s, the culture was different in medicine. The training was different. You know, we were basically given one tool in the toolbox, and that's just to work harder, you know, no matter what. And I think now, in the training of young physicians, you know, we're much more likely to talk about work-life balance and talk about well-being and talk about taking care of yourself. And things are improving. They're improving slowly, but I think that they are improving.
Well, all big changes, right? Take time.
Yeah.
Um, so there's also another theme in your book. Then I think you kind of tap on it a little bit where you say, man, I'm glad they have really good malpractice insurance or insurance. But there's this theme that you have of almost like making mistakes. Like making mistakes is okay, and you've seen it throughout your career. And I think there are some people who believe that maybe doctors shouldn't make mistakes, that they should have hyper rationalize, rationalization and superior problem solving skills. But I found it incredibly vulnerable and that you took those moments where you said, I made a mistake here, I made a mistake here. Would you say that that was one of your goals to sort of share that mistakes do happen, or would you say that's just a product of your natural storytelling?
Well, one goal that I had when I sat down to write the book was to try to portray doctors as humans. And I think the tendency among patients is maybe to look across at your doctor and think of them as a robot. But, we have bad days and bad months and unfortunately even bad years. And I
Mhm.
think one goal I had in writing the book was to humanize doctors. And so all of us have good traits and not so good traits. And all of that comes through in the book, not only in me, but in the people I worked with as well. And I want, you know, the reader to understand that also, as human beings, doctors are feeling things as they're taking care of you. And that was important for me to get that message across.
Yeah, I think that would sort of change. I think as a reader, it does change the way I view my doctor, that we're kind of like in a similar journey. If not, we're in this journey together in my care, but they also have their own personal journeys. And I think that makes it more of a human experience. Um, your memoir hits a lot of universal difficult experiences. There's death, identity, mental health. In your acknowledgments, you mentioned Danny Shapiro and that they showed you that writing a memoir can lead to understanding and healing. Did you learn that in retrospect, or was there some kind of a specific aha moment when you were writing?
I had a sense that writing this memoir was going to be cathartic for me. And I think that when I sat down to write it after I had left Stanford in 2016, I did most of the drafting of it in 2017. In fact, the entire first draft I got out in about 4 months. And it came sort of pouring out of me. Of course, it took an additional 2 years to edit it, but the first draft of it came pretty easily, and it really wasn't that difficult for me to figure out what direction I was going to go. Danny also has, told me and many others that, what we write about kind of announces itself. It chases us around.
Mm,
And I definitely had that sensation. I had this story to tell, and it was going to come out one way or the other.
very nice. So this is your first book. We do have a lot of local authors that have that, spur from the Bay Area. What advice would you give to an aspiring writer?
Wow, I don't even feel qualified to give that advice, but the one thing that I have learned, I was actually told this before I wrote the book, is how difficult it is. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that there's plenty of people with great book ideas, and there's plenty of people that can write well. But I think to take those ideas, to write well, and to get a book done is, is an entirely different proposition that takes a lot of perseverance. It reminded me a lot of my training period when I was learning how to be a transplant doctor, because I went through the same kind of feelings. I mean, there was a lot of insecurities, there was a lot of frustrations, there was a lot of, I can't do this. But it really takes just plowing through it. And many authors also told me this beforehand, that there's going to be people that don't like your writing, people that reject your writing. All that's part and parcel of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be refreshing for some of our aspiring writers to know that writing writing a book might be as hard as becoming a surgeon in a very difficult field. But I think that's very refreshing to hear that, maybe not everyone will like it. Um, what would you say is the biggest takeaway that you would like for your book, for your readers to take from this book?
I imagine, when I was going through it, that no matter what professional field people are in, and I've talked to a lot of different groups since the book has come out. I've talked to Wall Street traders and airline pilots and lawyers and, of course, a lot of doctors. No matter which field you're in, no matter what walk of life you're in, prioritizing that balance is really important. And one thing that I did not do well at times during my career was stay connected to the things that mattered to me. And I'm definitely now encouraging folks to choose connectedness and not isolation, because isolation is really the enemy. And so when times get tough, some of us, me included, actually, disconnect from the things that matter the most to them. And for me, it was I would stick my nose in a book, and my family was around, and I would just, take comfort in the book or watch a game on television. I think it's important to stay connected with the people that matter to you. And so it doesn't matter what you do professionally, you've got to do that.
Oh, that's really nice. I think especially now when very many people are experiencing burnout from such a hard year, that sort of giving that refresher on, be with the people, be with the things you love.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading quite a bit lately about the epidemic of loneliness because I think even before the pandemic, I think we were getting increasingly isolated from one another. That's happening in medicine as well. Medical people, healthcare workers, tend to socialize and hang out outside of the hospital less and less. We did that a lot when I was starting out in the career, and I saw less and less of it. But I think now, especially, we've got to stay in touch with one another.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to take a quick pause from our discussion just to remind everyone that if you do have a question for Dr. Weil, please drop it in our Q&A. So then when we're going to quickly actually approach our Q&A part. So I'd hope to have some questions ready for him. Um, so I guess I have maybe one more book related question. I have two personal questions. So one of the book related questions is you mentioned that you have been talking to like other doctors. How do other doctors respond to your book? Do they feel like, oh no, you told our secrets?
I'm sure I'm sure there's some of that, but those doctors tend not to contact me, I guess. But there must be some of that. No, to be honest with you, I've given I think 25 or so presentations. I gave one today at big medical centers across the country. Zoom's been good, so I can cover a lot of ground. Um, I'm hearing the same thing from a lot of healthcare workers, not just doctors, but nurses as well. That, thank you for saying the things that we've been thinking, but actually nobody's really said. And so the response has been great. It really has. Now, I mean, is it uniformly been wonderful? I don't know because I haven't heard, the kind of criticism that may be out there. But nonetheless, I think healthcare workers right now, especially, are begging to be seen and be heard. And I think that all of us really want the rest of the world to know, what it's like to do the kind of work that we do. My book doesn't have anything to do with COVID per se, but it has something to do with taking care of a sick patient population. And the workers that are out there right now, tonight, as we speak, are really under duress, and we've got to remember that and act accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. I think that was, I think I think when I was reading through your book, I was thinking you're like you're approaching 2020, you're coming closer and closer. And
Well,
I think your book ends right at 2019, but you're talking about how you're still active in in medicine, and you still are with your the Wild Consulting Group. Um, so it made me, I was thinking that if you had any particular feelings, but I think you definitely conveyed it with your talking with other groups and hearing the nurses and the other medical professionals, especially during this time.
yeah, I work with a lot of hospitals right now in my consulting practice, and I'm hearing the same things. It's just it is a very difficult environment. It affects transplantation in a variety of ways, but it also affects people at work. There's the hospital work, the medical care, that's hard enough. But then those folks leave the hospital and they get into the political arguments about masks and the vaccine and all these kinds of different things and shutdowns. And so, I think their message pretty clearly would be to the rest of the people that aren't inside the hospitals, you ought to come walk around with me for a little while. You might change your opinion about things.
Yeah, I I, I believe that. Um, okay, so why don't we? move to our Q&A section, and I do see that we, if you have any questions, please drop it in our Q&A, or you can even just drop it in the chat. Both of them are good options. Do we have any questions for Dr. Weil? Okay. Well, I'm going to keep with my questions then. And then if you do have any questions, I will incorporate them as soon as they come in. So, one of your recent interviews with Medium, this you make this joke about the lack of creativity in your organization's name, the Weill Consulting Group. If you could rename it, what would it be?
Oh gosh, that is a tough question. I'm terrible at this kind of thing. When I started my consulting practice, I thought, well, it's going to be consulting, and there's a group of us, and my last name's Weil, and it's Weil Consulting Group. No, I really don't know. I'm not particularly creative when it comes to this kind of thing, so I think I'll have to give that some more thought.
Okay, that sounds great. Um, what is the next step in your writing journey?
Well, I've got a few different ideas. I'm very busy, promoting Exhale right now, and it doesn't lend itself well to writing another book. I've found that's one thing I've discovered. Um, what I'd like to do next, though, is write about some of the systemic problems in healthcare
Mm,
and storytell it. Not, I don't want to write a policy book about all the problems in healthcare, but talk about accountability and privilege and access and tell stories about how I saw all of this in work and racial disparities in healthcare, which I saw in action, and things that will bring to life the problems that we read about that you might hear statistics about, but do that through my own patient experience because I think the best teacher are these stories, and I think medicine needs storytelling. I think the lay public, the people outside of medicine, might have difficulty relating to some of the problems unless we put a story around them. And that's what I want to do next. I also think that within that, I want to talk quite a bit about the electronic medical record. And
mm,
so it sounds like a dry topic, but it's not, because anybody that's been to a doctor recently has experienced what it's like to be taken care of by a healthcare worker who's staring at the computer and you're staring at the back of their head while they type. I think the electronic medical record has not fulfilled its promise and is impacting healthcare in a very negative way.
oh, interesting. I actually recently, when I had gone to one of my healthcare providers, I was really impressed on how quickly she was able to type, listen, and talk at the same time. And now that you mention it, I have a feeling that the listening part might have fallen off at some point.
I suspect so, but I'm also talking to some of my friends that are on the front lines of medicine that are seeing patients all day long and they can't possibly feed this beast, this electronic medical record. And so they're coming home at night and working for 3 hours on the computer. And I think those of us who went into medicine, our goal was not to stare into a computer all day long. And that doesn't even get to the idea that, that medical errors are happening as a result of bad information being put into the computer or being propagated time and time again, because people just copy whatever was put in there before. So I, I'm not I don't want to go back to the Stone Ages, but at the same time, I'd love to see progress made on that technology so that it's not what it is right now. And I
Yeah,
don't think it's very effective right now.
I, I think that's very fair. It's interesting that your next book is going to be talking about maybe some of these problems that you see that you saw as a director, as a leader, that it kind of pops up here and there in your book.
Yeah.
You don't spotlight it because I feel like you're focused more on, you know, the journey of, these individual patients and things. Um, but it seemed like you connected more as when you were able to be a doctor for an individual than you were as a leader or a figurehead, and in that way, would you say that's probably accurate?
I agree with you. I mean, the bottom line is I wanted to be with the patients, and I think that, while I touch on some of the issues within healthcare and our system, you know, there was I was unable to really focus on that because of the journey that I wanted to tell about. But yeah, I agree with you. There's you know there's frustrations, I think, in anybody that leads any big organization. I had 55 people that worked under me, and it was a lot of personnel issues and a lot of bureaucratic issues and politics and ego and everything else. And, at the end of the day, the time that I enjoyed the most was when I was talking one on one with the patient. And unfortunately, that happened less and less during the course of my career.
Yeah. There is a question that you asked all of your transplant patients. You bring it up throughout your book. Would you like to say what that question is?
Yeah, what would you do if today was your last day?
And what spurred that question? What created that question?
I wanted to ask that question, and sometimes I asked it in a way, what would you do if you could breathe better?
Hmm.
And the purpose of it really was to get patients to talk, so that I could find out a little bit about them other than what I could see in the medical record. I wanted to ask these kind of questions, what would you do if today was your last day? All of us would be like, wow, that's a tough question to answer. But the first things that come to your mind are very important. And in asking those kind of questions, I got to hear what a patient's priorities were, what's important to him or her.
Hmm.
And that's valuable information. It tells you a lot about a person, really. And I
Yeah.
heard a whole range of answers, everything you could possibly imagine.
Is there like one that is especially funny to you
Yeah,
or
there's a lot that are funny. One guy said I would sit in a bar and drink all day, and one guy said, I would get as far away from my family as possible, and then we had other people that would say I would spend all day in church, or I would pray with my family, or I would, visit my mother, or I would hang out with my friends, you know,
Mhm.
chase grandchildren, you know, and they tell you this, and without knowing anything else about a person, you know what they're about,
Right.
right? It doesn't take much imagination.
We had received a question in our Q&A, and I think I'd like to clarify that this isn't asked when waking up from surgery. This is asked before the surgery. That's correct, right, Dr. Weil, that you asked this before the, the lungs have gone in?
Definitely. I'm reading the question myself. Um, no, I definitely would not ask that after the surgery. That would not be good. I ask it the first time I meet a patient. Um, Patients come to see us for transplant. They're very sick. They've all thought about the prospect of dying, and they've had to process that. And so when I ask that question, I don't think I take anybody by surprise, really, because they've thought about it. They've already considered what's important to them.
Yeah, I think that's very true. We also have another question. It says, if someone very close to you were to be terminally ill, how confident are you towards the current medical establishments, including the trained doctors?
Yeah, well, what I write about in my book is somebody very close to me was terminally ill. My father actually received a liver transplant during the course of my book. Um, what I wrote about early on in my career. So I was 5 years into my career when my father received a liver transplant, and it changed my view of medicine. It no longer became a doctor's perspective. I was now a family member's perspective, totally different. Changed everything for me, really. That and having children of my own. But to answer the question, I think because it's an important one, part of what I want to write about next is I do think that American medicine has lost its fastball in many ways. I think while we could easily say we had the best healthcare system in the world when I was growing up in the field, I think we have a harder time saying that now. And that saddens me because I think we could do so much better. Right now, we have a very fragmented system, and anybody that's interacted with the healthcare system knows that. It's disjointed, it's fragmented, it's inefficient, and we've put profit over purpose. And I think that that's very concerning going forward. And I unfortunately don't think that that's going to get better anytime soon.
There was a second part to that question as well that says, how much would you rely on doctors? I think you might have answered part of it. And then would you set out to do research on your own in that area in order to save your loved one?
Definitely to the second question. The most important thing any of us can do is be informed consumers. And what's amazing to me is, I've worked in the transplant field for 3 decades now. And when people come to see their transplant doctor, whether it was me when I was working at Stanford or with the program that I'm consulting with now, they don't know anything about the quality of that program generally. And there's very little way for them to actually know whether or not that transplant program is any good. So we know more about the TV we buy or the computer that we buy than the transplant program where we're putting our lives in their hands. So definitely do the research. And I tell all of the people that I work with, ask questions and don't stop until you get them all answered. I think that, the healthcare industry owes that to the patient group.
I think that was probably one of the bigger things that I realized when I was reading throughout your book was how little I knew about transplant care and the process that goes with it. And I thought there was some parts of it where I go, that feels a little subjective and it worries me.
Yeah, a lot of it is subjective. I write about this in the book. We every week we had something called the selection meeting, which I always thought was rather ironically named, where we were selecting candidates for transplant. And, we obviously looked closely at the medical data and the objective data, but there was all kinds of subjective value statements made in what we did and value judgments. And, as hard as we tried to avoid doing that, it crept into that meeting quite a bit.
Yeah. Um, I would say in some places you can see the good and bad about some patients being more friendlier than others.
Yeah, yeah, and there's patients. I mean, we're also human, and there's patients we like more than other patients. And I write in the book about a patient I became very close to, and was devastated when she passed. And that's human. I used to think when I first started out in the field that we should feel the same way about everybody that we take care of, but that's not realistic.
We have another question that says, with years of experience working on the other side, what are your suggestions to patients when seeking medical care?
Research. I think that not only understand their disease, but also understand who's treating you. And I think that the more informed, the better. And the one thing I liked quite a bit about working in the Bay Area at Stanford was how well informed many of our patients were. I think it's a patient population that likes to learn and likes to read and likes to investigate. And many of our patients came to see us while I was there and asked very good questions. Not everything you read on the internet is true, but some of it is. And I think the more informed you are, the better you'll be.
I think that's great. Okay. If there are more questions, please drop it in the Q&A. Thank you so much for dropping those other questions. It's making us all ask really good things about patient care, our own and your experience with working with medicine and if how you would care for your loved ones. So I think that was really great questions so far. Um, there is a comment in our Q&A that says, I like Stanford, but it's just way more expensive than, say, PAMF.
At PAMF, yeah. Um, that's true. Uh, I heard that a lot from our patient group. I got involved in some of the negotiations regarding transplant care with insurance carriers, and the insurance carriers definitely pointed out to us often how expensive the care was there. And I think it happens for a variety of reasons. I think one reason would be it's the Bay Area, and the hospital's biggest costs are always the people that work there, and the salaries have to be in keeping with the cost of living, and I'm sure that drives the prices up for that care.
Yeah, I believe that. I actually, when you said it's the Bay Area and when you said the highest cost, I thought you were going to say is the building because that that would make sense too.
That's also true. That's also true.
Um, oh yeah, so the comment includes that PAMF is also in the Bay Area. So I guess it might go, the question is why are two medical institutions might have such a huge disparity?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if one of the differences is Palo Alto Medical Foundation doesn't have a hospital.
Mm,
So it's an outpatient facility. They used, at least they did while I was there, used Stanford Hospital as its hospital. So I'm not sure what cost the question refers to, but I wonder if it has something to do with hospital care versus outpatient care.
mhm.
Not sure.
Okay, I think that's fair. Okay, there is no more questions in our Q&A, but I'm going to just keep going with our other questions. Um, there is this, I'm not sure if it was a writing technique, but you do mention sort of like historical points throughout your book. The night you mentioned the Twin Towers at sort of almost like marking a historical point. There's another point where Barack Obama is campaigning to be president, and then there's another part where he's actually president. So I thought that was an interesting choice. Um, and I wanted to know what inspired you to sort of make these like historical milestones throughout your book.
Yeah, I did that intentionally. I'm the kind of person where I don't sit down, necessarily and watch the news every night, but I kind of have one eye on it. And what's interesting about walking around the hospital, and I was in the hospital during 9/11 and many, many other things, and TVs are on everywhere in the hospital. And you go in a patient's room and the TV's on, and you catch these little snippets of news. Like you never get the full digestion of the news, but you get these little snippets. And so what I wanted to sort of get across is that as I was doing this career, I was catching what was going on in the outside world, but I could never fully immerse myself in it. 9/11, impacted me like it did so many other people, but it was my remembrances of it were mostly catching little bits of it in the hospital, or when the O.J. Simpson verdict came down, for instance, everybody was watching it in a waiting room. You know, um, when Barack Obama was running for president, it affected a lot of people profoundly, and people were watching. When I went to see them in the hospital, folks were watching that on TV.
Yeah.
You know, Donald Trump got elected. Same thing. Everybody's kind of watching whatever's going on, and I'm moving in and out of the room, catching little bits of it.
Oh, that's such an interesting imagery. There's, you're so focused on your work and the world is moving around you. And I
Yeah.
thought that was that's a nice image. Um, there is a question that has, what's your general stand or advice towards healthy aging? any comments about Dr. Sinclair, author of Lifespan?
I haven't, as the second question first, I haven't read that book, um, but should. I've been told a lot about it. I've been asked about it, and I've got to really make myself a note to read it. Um, there's a few things that we can all do that are really, really important. One is not to smoke, and so, that's the first thing to staying healthy. It's interesting to watch now the country have this debate about vaccinations and the rage that's starting to happen among those of us who are vaccinated against those who aren't vaccinated. And it's very interesting to see how different people from different backgrounds handle their healthcare needs. There's some people that seemingly, don't handle them the way I would, but at the same time, it's extremely individual how that happens. So whenever we think about healthcare, we have to think about it in the context of that individual. And I think that that's something that we probably haven't done a great job of in this country. You know, we we think about healthcare as the same for everybody, but it's probably not. I think, for instance, something I am interested in is the racial disparities in healthcare. People of color have a different healthcare system than white people do. It doesn't work as well for them. And we have to remember that, because the only way to really address it is to understand the experiences that they have with it. And I think that that's, something I really want to delve into more deeply.
I think that's going to be an amazing research topic. I think it's going to be hard, but I do commend you for working towards it. Um, you mentioned that you haven't had a chance to read Lifespan, but usually what I like to ask my authors is, one, what are you reading now? Or what would you say, you can name two or three titles that have deeply, profoundly impacted you?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question. I right now, I'm reading Clint Smith's Every Word Is Past, um, a book about an author's walk through the slavery journey, which I think is very interesting. I gravitate toward memoir quite a bit. I think it's voyeuristic in certain ways to look inside somebody else's life. So I am attracted to Dani Shapiro's work. Her book Inheritance, I thought was outstanding. Looking at her own personal identity. So those are the kind of books that I'm most attracted to. I'm also reading Walter Isaacson's book about uh, Jennifer Doudna, who was in the Bay Area, who invented the CRISPR technology, gene editing technology.
Very nice. Those are a good selection. There are some people who are cluster readers, like they'll read several books at one time, and then there's some person who will just read one book. Um,
Right.
it sounds
Right.
like you might be the cluster kind.
Or yes, yes, definitely. In everything in life.
That's great. So it looks like we don't have any more questions in our Q&A, but I do want to drop our giveaway raffle form into the chat so it gives everyone an opportunity. This giveaway raffle is you just need to put in some contact information and something that we can reach you, especially if you are a winner, and you can come and grab our Dr. Weill's book Exhale here at the Santa Clara City Library. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Weil, for coming and joining us today and sharing your book with us. If you enjoy Dr. Weil's voice and are interested in his audiobook, we do have it available in our e-audiobooks through Overdrive and Libby. We also do have the ebook and book available. So all you need is a Santa Clara library card, and you'll be able to pick it up here at Santa Clara City Library. All right. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Dr. Weil.
I appreciate it. Thank you.